Is that an actual yes? I'm sorry. Okay, cool. Cool. All right. So when I was in high school, around the time I learned to play guitar, I worked at Subway. I had a job as a sandwich artist. Some of you guys know this really well. I told a million stories about Subway, but I worked at Subway, and for 2 years, that's what I did. You know, I tell all these stories because like they're those formative years, and I interacted with a lot of people and did a lot of different things. And there's some funny stories and some not so funny stories, and it's not like I'm proud of it, right? Like I wasn't proud of working at Subway. It wasn't like this thing that I was stoked on or excited about or now am. Like I was happy that I wasn't working. Like fast food sandwiches, I always thought was better than fast food burgers because like if I always smelled like rotten vegetables and moldy bread. And I don't know why. Like I don't know what that makes you think that you shouldn't go to Subway, but always smelled like moldy bread and rotten vegetables. But I thought that had to be better than smelling like an old fryer. And I don't know if that's true or not, but in my head, it was like, yeah, absolutely. This is the lesser of the two evils. So I mean, like, I was happy. I got free food. I ate a lot of food. I put on a lot of weight in the first year, as a growing boy, being told you can eat whatever you want. Like it was fun. Mess with the customers and stuff. It was fun. So I enjoyed it, but like I wasn't really proud of it. But there was one sense in which working at Subway was a huge sense of pride for me, and that was which Subway I worked at. You see, people are just stupid competitive. Like we're dumb about like I don't know if you guys notice about like tribalism and division that like it's not even about like reasonable things or important things. Like it's very often about the dumbest things. And I was really stupidly proud that I worked at the Subway I worked at because in my town we had two Subways. We had the East Side Subway, and you guessed it, we had the West Side Subway, right? And I was an East Sider, I was that's what I was. So we always convinced ourselves we were the better Subway, right? Like I don't know why. Like we didn't even like our jobs, but like we were convinced that like our job we didn't like was better than your job you don't like. Subway on the other side of town. And like it was like the dumbest stuff, like the dumbest reasons. We'd be like, okay, well, we're busier. And we were like we made more money. We were always busy. We were across the street from a factory, so the factory always let out in like shifts for like lunch and dinner and stuff. So we were always busy, just constantly busy. And like that was more work for us, and yet we took it as like a sense of pride. I don't know why. We were next to a car wash, and I was like, well, our people have clean cars, so we got a higher clientele, higher caliber of people at our Subway. We were kind of like a half mile away from the local ice cream shop, so you could get Subway and a milkshake if you wanted. You know, if you weren't doing the Subway diet back when that was a thing. You guys remember the Subway diet? Remember how Subway convinced the world that like eating endless carbs and like salty meats that aren't really meats. By the way, back in the day, it wasn't even ham. It was a ham and water product. I'm not kidding. That's what it was. I don't know what it is now, but the like literally like ham and water product on a piece of bread, and they somehow convinced the country that's diet food. It was crazy. So anyway, if you wanted to pair that with a milkshake, you could. So I don't know. It was really dumb, and we were dumb, but we were really competitive. So one day though, I was on the west side of town, not usually on the west side of town. I was on the west side of town, and I don't know what the circumstances were exactly, but I went to the enemy. I went in to the west side subway. That's where you guys are supposed to go. Ooh. Thank you. Thank you. You guys are with me now. That's good. That's good. Okay. And here's what I noticed. I noticed a crazy thing about the West Side Subway. The West Side Subway wasn't just a subway. It was a subway, and inside of Subway was a Noble Roman's pizza. Okay, so you guys didn't react to that, and that's a problem. That just tells me that you never grew up in Indiana. So Noble Roman's Pizza, thank you, D. Yeah, Noble Roman's, it's awesome, right? Yeah, Noble Roman's Pizza is this fast food pizza chain, right? And it is, okay, so we got to do like a power ranking so we can understand. So like, it's definitely better than Domino's because it tastes like, not the box it came in. So start there. Definitely better than Domino's. It's also definitely better than Papa John's. Okay, I know, but like, man, that guy's a liar when he's like, better ingredients, better pizza. Better ingredients than what? A foot? Like, come on. Like, Papa John's is terrible, and I will hear no argument on that. It's bad. Noble Romans is better than those two, for sure. So we're already up the ladder. It's also better than Little Caesars, though I have to admit, there was nothing on the Noble Romans menu that was as good as Little Caesars Crazy Bread. Because Little Caesars Crazy Bread is maybe the best fast food item ever. It might be. It's definitely in the Fast Food Hall of Fame. It's definitely going to be in fast food heaven. St. Peter and my Uncle Harry, who created In-N-Out, we're going to be eating Little Caesar pizza all day. You're going to look up the guy who created In-N-Out later. Do that. It's fun. Anyway, it's great, you know. So, like, I think it's better than Little Caesars, but it's like a half, because, like, if you go to Little Caesars and just get the pizza, that's a mistake. Save $2 and just eat a whole bag of bread. Not for a diet, though. This is not 2001 at Subway. So, it's definitely, Noble Roman's not better than Pizza Hut, though, because Pizza Hut's the king, of course. Of course it is. Pizza's great. And again, anytime somebody's like, I don't like Pizza Hut, I just don't know if I trust that person. You know, like, okay, it's obviously the worst thing for you. It's like 1,500 calories per slice or whatever, but like, it's so good. Did you guys know, one of my best friends worked at Pizza Hut. They would like put oil in the pan for the pan pizza. Like they would load it with like that much oil and then put dough in it, and it would seep in there all night. And that's their pan pizza. That's why it's delicious and why you should never eat it. But also, I want to get it for dinner tonight, now that I've talked about it. So, power rankings, Noble Romans is basically like, it's definitely like, it was most like Subway, or it was most like Pizza Hut, and it was like basically the silver medal of fast food pizzas. And this Subway, the West Side Subway, had Noble Romans in it. Like, I was blown away by that. I was just, my brain melted. I couldn't figure out what was happening. Because, like, on the one hand, like, what a good idea. You know, like, what a great idea. Like, again, I was a growing boy at the time. I could eat, 8,000 calories in a sitting. The idea of getting, like, a foot-long club and, like, a large Noble Romans pizza and just eating it all, I mean, that sounded like a great Tuesday night. Like, what a good idea. I can't believe I didn't think of it. Like, it's so great. Because Noble Romans, again, is great. Great. They had breadsticks and cheese. Oh, everything was so good. It's all flooding back to me, by the way. I'm talking about Noble Romans, and like I can almost taste it. I haven't had Noble Romans in 20 years because it doesn't exist here. But anyway, back to the sermon part of the story. It was a good idea. I thought it was a really good idea. But also, upon reflection, I realized it was not a thing I wanted for myself, right? Because okay, look, let's be honest. It doesn't really fit the vibe of the dieting thing. Like, Jared would not be happy with Noble Romans in a Subway. Like, it's not a thing. By the way, did you guys know that Jared didn't actually diet? He starved himself. Like, do we all know that story? Anyway, it's a whole thing. Like, he ate like a 6-inch sandwich every day, and that was all. And that's like 400 calories. And then he lost a bunch of weight, and then he's like, well, I did it with Subway. Nope, that was anorexia. Good job. Well done, Jared. But he became super famous for it, so I guess good for him. But like obviously, we were the health food store, right? Like, we were basically GNC at that time, and you can't serve pizza at GNC. That's a mistake. That wasn't the big deal, though. Really, it was because it's double the work. Boy, did I not want to do double the work for the Noble Romans. Like, I don't want to make sandwiches, guys. Much less sandwiches and pizza. I didn't want to do that. So I looked at the Subway, and I looked at it, and it was an interesting emotion. Like, it was an interesting thing because it was one of the first times in my life where I realized, like, okay, that's a good idea. Objectively speaking, I'm sure it's making them money. I'm sure it's a positive thing. I think it's a good thing to have pizza and subs together. Like, it's a good idea, but boy, is that idea not for me. So I can think this through and say, okay, well, that's a good idea, and that's good for them, and I can learn from it, and I can think about it, and I can maybe go through in my own head about what I, like or dislike, pros and cons. But at the end of the day, it's a good idea that's simply not for me. So while I appreciate and can, understand why they had a Noble Romans pizza, I was still continually glad that I worked at the Subway that did not have Noble Romans pizza. And that leads me to a brief history lesson. Ashland Christian Church is not, in fact, actually just a non-denominational church. It's kind of annoying, if I'm going to be really honest, with the rise the last like 15, 20 years of non-denominational churches that basically are just nothing. They're just nothing. And like it's not annoying. Like, I'm glad people go to church, but like people look at us, they're like, oh, so you're just nothing. And it's kind of frustrating to have to explain, like, no, we're actually not nothing. We actually come from the people who started the whole thing. So, like, for the first 1,800 years of the church has always belonged to something. There was always a hierarchy. There was always a group. There was always, at least usually, a central authority. If there wasn't a central authority, there was at least an authority that everybody could kind of trust if we're going all the way back to, like, the apostles and all that. Like, you even see in the Bible, like, they've got a problem, they go to a central authority and kind of have it handled, right? Like, hey, apostles, deal with this. And so that's the way churches always grew. Well, about 200 years ago, in the early 1800s, some guys got kicked out of their denomination. And it just so happened that they were in the Midwest America, like Kentucky, Ohio-ish area. I guess Kentucky's maybe not Midwest, but like ish. That part of the country. And it was post-Revolutionary War colonial America. And I don't know if you guys are aware of what the Revolutionary War was, but the Revolutionary War was all of our forefathers saying, we don't like authority. And so these guys get kicked out of their denominations, and they say, well, we don't like authority anyway. We don't like authority in our government, so why would we like authority in our church? And for like the first time in recorded church history, some people said, let's be purposely, intentionally independent. Which is very different than just not being anything. It's not that they weren't anything. It was that they are going to not be tied to a central authority, to a hierarchy in the church. That was a choice that they made strategically, specifically, and really they did it because they were, Americans, and that was great. What it was. We are part of that. It's called the Restoration Movement. It is the most American of church movements in the world because it was just, we are just thumbing our nose at authority, and that's just what we're doing. Well, they would never have said non-denominational. That wasn't the point. They were independent. And that obviously means non-denominational. It's, 6 of one, half dozen of the other. But for them, the idea was simply, we're going to be our own thing, and other churches like us will be loosely affiliated and united around common ideals. Meaning, this independent church in this town in Kentucky is going to be basically the same-ish as that independent church in this town in Ohio. And they may do different things, and they may say different things, but at the end of the day, they share the same values and ideals. And I'm really proud of that. Like, I actually, we don't talk about it much because it's a 200-year-old thing and all that. But, Ashland Christian Church comes from that movement. We are part of that movement. I am very proud that we are part of that movement, that we're part of what's called the Restoration Movement. And the Restoration Movement has these ideals, and they put them in slogans because apparently they were bad at reading. And because it was 200 years ago. And it was hard to remember stuff. And so they're like, well, we'll just come up with slogans. The best way to communicate your truth is through a witty saying or something you remember. So they said, okay, here's who we are. We have no creed but Christ, no book but the Bible, no law but love. Fits on a poster. You can hand it out on a flyer, put it on a T-shirt. Screen printing had been invented. I have no idea when screen printing was invented. Not 1820, I promise. But you can put it on a T-shirt. It's pretty good. So another one that they had that was really good, they said, in essentials, unity. In non-essentials, liberty. And in all things, love. They always landed on love, which is why it's great. And why we still, it's still a really good thing to hold on to over and over and over. There was one that was kind of naive and kind of, shows kind of, if you're into history, kind of shows, why it didn't totally work, but it was still a good idea. So they said, where the Bible speaks, we'll speak. But where the Bible is silent, we won't speak. Man, what a great goal to have. That's just super impossible. But what a good goal to have. If you're going to do theology, that's such a good, lofty thing to go. So that's what they had. They had all these kind of sayings, and they were purposely independent, and they were purposely just doing, look, we don't need to answer to anybody but God. We don't need to try to be like anybody other than Christians. And that leads to my absolute favorite of the sayings, the one that I think is really at the core of who I've tried to be as a Christian my whole life, and who if I'm being frank, I don't know if I'm speaking for everybody at the church. I never speak for everybody at the church, but for me, like, if we could be a church that could, be defined by one of these, it's this slogan that we are not the only Christians, but we are only Christians. We are not the only Christians, but we are only Christians. Man, that's so good. And here's what's so good about that, because it really reflects two things. It reflects humility and it reflects respect. By saying that, like, we are only Christians, that is a statement of humility. It is saying we don't have all the answers, okay? Like, we're not going to sit here and pretend like we, use all these theological things, all these theological ideas, all these debates, all these issues, all these, like, that blows up that church and that blows up that church, and this is what this church is known for and this is what that church is known for. The Restoration Movement, the people that we come from, they did everything they could to just step away from all that and just, look, we don't know what, we don't have all the answers. I'm not going to sit here and pretend like we have got it figured out. We are just Christians. We are just trying to follow Jesus. That's it. In everything we do, we're just trying to follow Jesus. That's all. That's all we're trying to do. But that first part, that we are not the only Christians, well, that is a statement of respect. That's a statement that allows other people to hold viewpoints that you don't agree with, that allows other churches to have practices you would not adopt on your own. And instead of sitting around and talking about how terrible other churches are, or what a terrible thing it is, or what a bad idea it is, or why you wouldn't do it that way, by simply saying we are not the only Christians, it is a confession that, other people may disagree with us, and we can respect that, and we can leave it alone. We don't have to try to convert anybody. We don't have to try to say, well, this is the way that you are, and so come to our side. It's just, look, if that's what you believe and that's how you are, okay. This is who we are, this is what we do. Okay. It's a beautiful sentiment of respect for other people. It is, in fact, saying, you know what? I don't think it's a good idea to have Noble Roman's pizza in a Subway. I don't want to do double the work. It doesn't fit with our MO. Now, instead of just smelling like old vegetables and bread, you're smelling like old vegetables, bread, and pizza sauce. I don't love it, but you know what? I understand why you do it. I understand what you're after. I understand what you benefit from it, and so I'll respect that. That's what our church and our church movement was built on. And I got to say, we're real bad at it. Being totally honest. Because the easiest thing in the world is to judge other people. Like, there's a reason why, like, don't judge is said over and over in the Bible. There's a reason why we currently live in a culture in which it is a virtuous thing to stand as judge for everybody else and then say, well, see, I'm a good person because I judged that guy right. Like, there's a reason for that. Because judging is so easy. And also, let's be honest, it's so much fun. But see, where we come from, our church specifically said, we're not the only Christians. We're not here to worry about anybody else. We just want to follow Jesus ourselves. And here's what's beautiful about that. That allows us to say, okay, I am not going to be like these Christians. I am not going to adopt their practices. I'm not going to do what they do. But because I respect them, because I recognize that they're also Christians, because I am admitting that I don't have all the answers, what we can do now is we can learn. And we can think about it. And we can reflect on it. And we can say, okay, what's the good part about this? Why do they do what they do that's so different than us? And what can we take away from that? I think we need more of that in the church. And so for the next 5 weeks, that's what we're going to do. The next 5 weeks, we are going to talk about a practice in the church amongst Christians that we don't do. And we're going to try to learn from it. And we're going to say, okay, what does that teach us? They have a reason for what they're doing. What does it teach us about our lives, knowing that we are just Christians and we are not the only Christians? What does it teach us for us to be able to be? Our new sermon series is called Not the Only Christians. And before we go anywhere else, I'm going to offer a disclaimer that I'm offering each and every week because I do not want to be misunderstood. Boy, do I not want a text message here in 3 days saying, well, Drew, why did you say we're doing that? I am not endorsing anything. In fact, I'm specifically not endorsing things. What we talk about are things we don't do. We are not at the end of this sermon series going to adopt any new practices that we talk about. It's not what we're doing. So please don't be like, well, Drew, you said we're doing that. Like you preached a whole sermon on it. It's not what we're doing. We are learning from people who, by definition, are not like us. Cool? So disclaimer, you're going to hear 5 times. It's going to happen, guys. But Drew, you preached it. All right. So our first week. Let's start easy. Let's start simple. Let's dive in. Like, I'm not a big dive in the water head first guy. I'm a put a toe in and be like, oh, that's cold. Better put an ankle in. Yeah, still cold. Better put, we're gonna ease into this. We're gonna do the easiest one. Easiest one. Okay? We're gonna talk about the crucifix. And I don't mean the Canadian Cripplers finishing move. Cam. It's not what I'm talking about. Talk about the crucifix. Okay, so here we go. Real simple definitions, okay? That's a cross. If you turn around right there, that's a cross. Also, there's one behind me. I could have done that. That's a cross. That's a cross. 2 things, the two beams. If you do this, that's what you do when the vampire shows up. If you don't have a cross, you do this. Because it's a cross. It's 2 beams like a T. It's, it can be made of wood, metal, plastic, anything you want to do. It's a cross. That is a cross. A crucifix is a cross with Jesus on it. He's either dead or dying, depending on your interpretation, and depending on maybe how you want to look at it. So we have a cross, and we have a crucifix, which is a cross with Jesus on it. And you'll notice that is a cross, and that is a cross, and there is no Jesus on it, which means we are a church that does not have crucifixes. We just don't do it. However, that puts us in the minority in not only church history, but also the church now. You see, as it turns out, there's one group that can really skew the data when you talk about counting Christians. There's a Christian group called the Catholics, of which there is 1.2 billion of them. That's like the population of China. 1.2 billion Catholics. And you will not find a Catholic church anywhere that does not have a crucifix. Because by definition of their service for communion, called Mass, they must, by church law, have a crucifix present and right at the center of everything. So every Catholic around the world, and for the last 1,600 years, 1,500 years, has had a crucifix. So for about 1,500 years, the Catholics have all had crucifixes. But it's not just the Catholics. Also, the Orthodox Church, who I believe in the community meditation Stephanie mentioned. The Orthodox Church. There are hundreds of millions of Orthodox Christians around the world, usually in Europe, but hundreds of millions of Orthodox Christians around the world. Orthodox churches, who, by the way, are the oldest churches in the world, the oldest, state churches or assembled churches, I'm trying to think of institutional churches, they also have a crucifix. Not a cross, always a crucifix. Which means if you were to dump every church in the world, in church history and today, and you were to somehow put them in a giant hat, and you came along with a giant hand and said, I'm just going to pick a church out, statistically speaking, you would pick out a church that is covered in crucifixes. Because the crucifix is actually the most common thing. We don't do it. I'm not going to put a crucifix up at the end of this, I promise you. Just saying. We need to ask, why? What is it about the crucifix that for 1,500 years has sort of captured the imagination of Christians, other Christians that aren't us? And if you just ask them, it's very simple. Just Google why a crucifix. You'll find a very simple answer. The very simple answer is this. The cross is an ugly thing. And if we have what we have here, it can be easy to forget that. Especially when you wear it around your neck, or in jewelry or whatever, it can be very easy to forget that the cross is a mechanism of death. It's essentially an ancient electric chair. By putting Jesus on it, it is a reminder to every Christian who looks at it of the suffering that Jesus went through on that cross, the suffering he went to save us, the suffering he went through in order to build the church. And if you think, well, that's kind of creepy, actually, you're right. You are picking up what they are putting down. It is supposed to be creepy. You're not supposed to look at that and say, oh, how beautiful. You're not supposed to. You're supposed to look at that and say, how ugly is sin? How ugly is what the world did to the Son of God? How ugly is the suffering that produced our salvation? For Catholic and Orthodox and anyone else, I don't know that anybody else does it, but Catholic and Orthodox Christians, for them, it's not a bug, it is a feature to their symbols, that it is ugly, it is unpleasant, and it's supposed to make us think about those things that are not so great. Now, as it turns out, it's not a bad thought. And if I'm being really honest, it's a really biblical thought. Now, look, here's where I give the disclaimer that's real simple, okay? I've already mentioned it twice. One of the real sticky wickets here of using the crucifix instead of the cross is that no one did it for 500 years after the church. Like, it is actually the new kid on the block, which is hilarious because it's Catholic. Because usually you think about the Catholics, it's like the old stuff. But actually, within the first, literally century of Christianity being born, you almost, early 2nd century, you have the cross as the symbol of Christianity. And then several centuries later, hundreds of years later, they put Jesus on it. So if you and I are saying, okay, what are we trying to be? If we're trying to look at the scriptures, no book but the Bible, if we're trying to just be Christians, for us, it's actually going to be the cross, not the crucifix, because the crucifix comes a lot later. There's a lot more to it, but that's a basic thing. But even with that said, to look at the cross and see suffering, to look at Jesus and see his death above and beyond anything else is extremely biblical. In fact, every New Testament writer basically defends the practice of the crucifix. Here's what I mean. John writes this letter, and in this letter, he's talking about how God is love. How God is love, and that's a wonderful thought. What a great thought. But he defines that love that God is by Jesus' sacrifice on the cross. He defines love by a crucifix, by Jesus on the cross. That's John. Paul writes a whole lot of the Bible, so he does it a lot. I mean, there's one place where he's talking to a church, and he says, look, the only thing I ever talked about with you guys, the only thing I ever talked about was Jesus crucified. That's it. You guys had to get so tired. He didn't say that, but I mean, they had to get tired of all I ever spoke to you about ever was the crucifixion. That's it. That was the core of everything I talked about. Every sermon, every lesson was about the crucifixion. Later in another book, he actually talks about how he's not going to brag about anything. He's done all sorts of cool stuff. He's had all kinds of a crazy ministry. God has done so many things through him. He could brag about what God has done through him and with him, and I mean, he could do that. But he said the only thing he will brag about, the only thing he'll boast about, is the crucifixion, is Jesus dying on the cross. We don't know who wrote Hebrews, but whoever that was, whoever he or she was, they wrote this really famous passage about how we are surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses, that everybody who went on before us is watching us as we are running the race of faith. They're cheering us on. Man, what a good idea. A beautifully poetic thing to think about, that we're in it with other people who have passed on. And say and that writer says, okay, we are running a race, and we're running a race chasing after the author and perfecter of our faith, the one who begins our faith and the one who completes our faith, being Jesus. But actually, the writer doesn't say Jesus. They say Jesus who died on the cross. And it is that death on the cross that gives him the place of highest honor. It's fascinating. I mentioned this actually on Good Friday. It's fascinating how the very first Christians, they are obsessed with the cross. Above and beyond any conversation about resurrection. And that's not to say that resurrection is not important. That is not to say that resurrection is not, obviously, like, there's in 1 Corinthians, if there's no resurrection, we have no hope. Like, it's not that that's not true. It's that for them, the core of everything that they built their lives on was Jesus dying on the cross. It's almost kind of strange to think they didn't have a crucifix then. And it took 500 years for it to happen because they constantly were talking about the crucifixion as everything. And you think, okay, well, what is there to even say? Like, that's the way God saved us. Okay, cool. And for a lot of us, that's sort of the idea. And what I think we need to learn actually is we should think about the cross much larger than that. What I think is beautiful about what the Catholic and Orthodox Christians do is they think about the cross in a whole soul, kind of a big picture forest for the trees kind of a way. They're not just looking and saying, that's how we're saved. They're looking at the cross sort of like another writer in the New Testament did. His name's Peter. Obviously, like it's the Peter not a new Peter. And this is what Peter wrote in his first letter about the cross and about us, and sort of in a very Catholic-y, orthodoxy, crucifix kind of a way. This is what we read in 1 Peter chapter 2. He says, God called you to do good, even if it means suffering, just as Christ suffered for you. He is your example, and you must follow in his steps. He never sinned, nor ever deceived anyone. He did not retaliate when he was insulted, nor threaten revenge when he suffered. He left his case in the hands of God, who always judges fairly. He personally carried our sins in his body on the cross, so that we can be dead to sin and live for what is right. By his wounds you are healed. Once you were like sheep who wandered away, but now you have turned to your shepherd, the guardian of your souls. Peter is talking about the cross. And yet he talks about the cross in the context of how we live. He directly says it. He personally carried our sins in his body on the cross so that we can be dead to sin and live for what is right. The end goal of the cross is not just, quote unquote, salvation. It's not just, quote unquote, being saved. It's not just, quote unquote, going to heaven when we die. It is, in fact, the end goal of the cross is to shape how we live, which is fascinating. We don't usually think about that. The cross is about life as much or more than it is about death. And Peter says the reason for that is because, well, God wants us to do the right thing. And guess what? Doing the right thing does not guarantee that we'll have good outcomes. In fact, very often, doing the right thing means guaranteed that we will have a bad outcome in this world. This world is fallen, broken, whatever you want to say. It's filled with people who aren't so great. It has sin in it, however you want to phrase that. And so very often doing the right thing means we will suffer as a result. So Peter says, do the right thing. God has called you to do what's right, even if you suffer, maybe especially when you suffer, by following in the footsteps of Jesus. And then he brings up two things about the cross. The first thing is weird. It's almost jarring to read it. It says that Jesus never sinned nor deceived anyone. I thought a lot about what that means, and I think what Peter was getting at was this. At any point, Jesus just could have lied and then not died on the cross. Like, at any point, when Pilate said, hey, are you what's going on? If he just said, guys, I don't know what he's talking about. Like, Pilate was looking for a reason to pardon him, and Jesus refused to give him one. All Jesus had to say at any point was, hey, Pharisees, you guys are great. Yeah, I'll be on Team Pharisee, no problem. He could have then turned around and kept doing all the stuff he was doing. I mean, like, that's sort of what a lot of people do. It's called being two-faced. Jesus could have openly, outwardly said, I am on your side, Pharisees. I will not go against you. And then had a bigger ministry. Now with the Pharisees backing, being who he wanted to be. Jesus could have deceived or lied or manipulated in any way. Jesus could have manipulated his way off the cross like that in a second. But he didn't. Because manipulating people is bad. Deceiving people is sin. Don't lie. Be who you are. Being two-faced, I mean, that's the type of thing he preached against over and over and over. He called those people hypocrites. But see, that's not even it. You see, Jesus also could have threatened. He could have lashed out in revenge and in anger and in violence. He tells his disciples that over and over. He's like, hey, man, like I could call down like heavenly armies and then, we win because it's a heavenly army versus an earthly army. And like they, it's 2,000 years ago. They don't have guns or nukes or anything. Like I picked a really good time to pick a fight with this army. They got swords and stuff, but whatever. Like Jesus could have fought and won over and over. We realize that, right? Like if Jesus fought back, he wins. Easily. But you see, that would have been wrong. That would have hurt. That would have killed the very people he was here to help. That doesn't at all do what he's supposed to do. See, Jesus going to the cross is a reflection of a choice that Jesus made to do the right thing and to trust God and not worry about the outcome. Jesus did the right thing. He trusted God, and he did not worry about the outcome, and it landed him on a cross. And Peter says, he is your example. Do the right thing, trust God, and don't worry about the outcome. And you might say, you might be tempted to say, oh, Peter doesn't know what I'm going through. Yeah, so Peter, at this time in history, was writing this at exactly the time when the very first bloodthirsty Caesar of Rome was killing Christians for fun. I dare say we don't know what Peter was going through. When he says suffer, he didn't mean oh, but they don't like me. No, he meant being tortured and getting killed, which Peter himself would be tortured and killed within a few years. Cross. Not the resurrection, by the way, which is not disrespectful to the resurrection, but the cross. Not even the Sermon on the Mount, which is not disrespectful to the Sermon on the Mount. The cross, which is not even Jesus' miracles. The cross. Specifically, Jesus dying on that cross, the image of the crucifix. That's what Peter said is our example for how we live our lives. The end goal of the crucifixion was that we would be dead to sin and live to do what's right. I think the Catholics and the Orthodox have the right idea. Personally, I think the crucifix is pretty cool. It's like Noble Roman's pizza, I wouldn't do it myself. I'm not bringing it in here. There's reasons not to. But at the end of the day, we can learn from that. And while we're not going to have a crucifix in Ashland Christian Church, I think we can learn from the attitude and the humble spirit and the willingness to engage in pain that our Catholic and Orthodox brothers and sisters in Christ are willing to do. They're willing each and every week to consider the suffering of Christ and use it as motivational as they take up their cross to follow Jesus. And we don't need a crucifix to do that. We just need the proper motivation, the proper attitude to say, you know what? The New Testament writers constantly talk about the cross. Jesus' example on the cross, Jesus's example on the cross is not just about salvation. It's not just about showing us who God is, though it does do that. It's about showing us who we can be. And that's difficult, and it's hard, and we need that reminder often. I think because we are only Christians, but not the only Christians, I think we can learn from the practice that we're not going to do, which is having a crucifix. And I think as we move on, as we leave today, we can consider that maybe as we think about the cross, and maybe we think about Jesus dying on that cross, that there's more to it than just, well, he died for my sins so I can go to heaven. But in fact, it is an example to us all of how we live each and every day with integrity, doing the right thing, trusting God regardless of the outcome. This morning, our first week of our series called Not the Only Christians. As we talk about people that are not us, we talk about the crucifix, which is not ours. We learn this lesson. Our first lesson from this series. The cross does more than save us. It models the way in which we should live, trusting and following Jesus. The cross does more than save us. It models the way in which we should live, trusting God and following Jesus. So when the musicians are going to come forward, we're going to sing a song. We offer an invitation each and every week to take up on this offer of relationship and salvation and hope and a way of life. The Bible teaches when we understand who God is, who Christ is, that we're to repent and be baptized. It sounds like two things. It's really just one. In repentance, we change our minds. We change who we are. We say, I want things differently. I want things the way God has them for me. In baptism, it is a physical picture of that. We ourselves, just as Christ was dead, buried, and raised, that we ourselves in that water are dead, buried, and raised. We are given new life, and we are made whole, given his spirit, forgiven of all things. And if you've never made the decision, you got a nice word in baptistry, all sorts of folks can do it. Let's talk. If you're already immersed believer in Christ, you're looking for a perfect church home, this place is not it. We do serve a perfect God. We want to connect, we want to call, we want to cultivate, we want to meet new people, we share the gospel, we want to grow up while we do it, and we are not the only Christians. But we are only Christians, and that means we want to learn from those around us with humility and respect. As we stand,